A very good afternoon to one and all present here today. I warmly welcome you all to the HackerEarth webinar series on innovation. We have with us Mr. Howard Yu today, who will be speaking on the topic of how to define an innovation strategy. Mr. Howard Yu is the author of Leap, How to Thrive in a World Where Everything Can Be Copied. He is a Lego professor of management and innovation at the IMD Business School in Switzerland. He is also a keynote speaker, and he has written for a lot of articles in Forbes, Fortune, the Harvard Business Review, the South China Morning Post, and a lot others. Without much further ado, I would like to pass on the proceedings to Mr. Howard. Mr. Howard, you can take it out from here.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So it's my great pleasure to be here. And I think the screen should now be shared. So just want to confirm people can see me a little bit, as well as the PowerPoint slide, the main screen is all actually okay. Does it look all right, Arun?
Yes, Mr. Howard, everything is good.
That's great. It's my great pleasure to be here. And today we're going to spend a bit of time in looking at, this whole idea around how to thrive in a world when everything can be copied. And just before I started, I'm a professor of management and innovation at IMD Switzerland. And the picture you see here is the region called Vaud, and it's Lake Geneva. And my school is about 10 minutes away from this region. And today's topic is really around the 2.5 years of research that I had on this particular topic on how company can thrive and be prosperous and also be competitive over a long period of time. Because as many of you may already aware, the industry life cycle continue to get faster and faster. And the sort of like lifespan of Fortune 500 company, in fact, have shrunk over the last century or so. In the 30 and the 40s, a typical company on S&P 500 can last over 60 years. Today, we're talking about just around 15. Not that this company would actually gone busted or disappear, but they simply drop off the league table. So the pressure for competition is really increasingly more and more, and it's particularly around this story on how can pioneering company can continue to stay innovative in a world when IP can leak elsewhere, job can migrate across border, capital can move across the financial market almost seamlessly. What can executive and manager can do to continue to gain that competitive advantage? And it's not just around strategy, because in many ways, as much as we want your company to be successful, we as individual, executive, and manager, we also need to reinvent ourselves, particularly in the age of AI, artificial intelligence, and smart machine. How do we make sure you can continue to develop value for your enterprise is also something that we'll touch upon. Now, with that in mind, we're going to launch into today's discussion. When I joined IMD about 8 years ago after my graduation from Harvard Business School, one of the key complaints that I've heard from executives is they said their product is getting commoditized, meaning their product is getting all kind of pricing pressure. They find it harder and harder to differentiate the marketplace. And we call it products are getting commoditized. So oftentimes what I ask the executive to tell me is, what are the usual response that large established company would do when they first experience this pain of product commoditization? And oftentimes what the response I've got comes down to two paths. One is company may try to lower their cost, expand the economies of scale, driving down the production cost in order to match with the competitive environment. So sort of the low cost strategy. That is all fine and good, except there are times we have to understand pursuing a low-cost strategy is essentially the last man standing strategy, meaning you can be Walmart, you can be Southwest. There would be one most competitive company, but is essentially winner take all. there could be only accommodating the lowest cost provider to sustain that type of brutal competition. So that's one path. The other path would be focusing around maybe a little bit more innovation. Think about the example for like introducing new product features, coming up with the next generation of machine or device or product. Or even these days, if you're selling a metal box, hardware, and appliances, it's very fashionable to think about let's wrap it around with services and call it a solution. Now, whether truly is a solution for your customer or it's merely a solution for the manager is up to debate. But by and large, these are the two realms that company can pursue when they see and observe that product are getting commoditized. Now, imagine you go in and pick the second mode. You're gonna try to innovate. You introduce new product features, new services. What happens usually is after 6 months, those new product features and those new services and idea simply getting copied by competitor. Then what do you do next? Well, we introduce the next round of innovation, and then they get copied again. Now, while this never-ending game keeps spinning around faster and faster, at a certain point, some low-cost provider, oftentimes from Asia, would then creep in and then disrupt the whole game. After all, as you continue to innovate, your cost structure is most likely to creep up. You need more R&D, you need more salespeople, the marketing expenditure, etc. However, if you think for a moment, this idea of getting commoditized, in fact, is quite a commonplace. You can see that from personal computer to mobile phone, from solar panel all the way to wind turbine. Historically, of course, think about automotive is the exclusive domain by companies such as General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Today, of course, back in the 60s, led by Toyota and Honda, Detroit turned Rust Belt. So from all kinds of sectors, we observe almost this inevitable dynamic that low-cost competition would creep in and disrupt the pioneering company from historically their leading position. However, the complaint that we've heard from automotive makers to solar panel to wind turbine, in fact, these complain that their innovation getting copied is not that new. In fact, if you think for a moment, this copying dynamic can be also almost traced back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. If you think for a moment like the Western textile industry, historically, it has been the exclusive domain for the British Empire. They export textile around the world. And what's interesting, of course, is around the turn of the century, the Americans are stealing that pattern. Now, the British Empire were very afraid. In fact, back then, if you are a textile worker, if you know how to build a textile machine, you're not even allowed to emigrate to the United States because they want to protect the know-how. If people are getting caught up at the pier, they would get jailed, they would get fined, and not allowed to leave the country. Compared with today's Silicon Valley kind of non-compete clauses and non-disclosure, those IP of today protection is almost tame compared with 200 years ago by the British Empire. But doesn't matter. There is an entrepreneur around the turn of the century. His name is Francis Lowe. He basically committed almost the most consequential industrial espionage of the entire history. So he's from New England in the United States, Boston. He went over to Scotland and Ireland just to tour around this textile factory, pretending that he's simply a wealthy merchant. Now, he's a mathematics major at Harvard, and he's got just this photogenic memory, can simply remember how this textile machine are built. And then he write down all the blueprint, smuggle across border, and bring it back to the United States. And of course, after 20, 30 years, he built up the biggest textile plant in this town called Lowell in New England, Massachusetts. That dominates the textile industry and begins to push out the British exporter from the world market. 30 years later, then it's no longer the northerner that dominate the textile industry. In fact, it's the southerner from North Carolina to South Carolina. They are building even bigger textile mill to attract and export even more cheap cloth to an overseas market. Now we're talking about around 1920s, and the biggest export market turns out to be China. Yes, the Chinese back then, 1920, couldn't get hold of enough cheap cloth. Think about today's trade dynamic. It's quite an irony, in fact. Now, of course, the Southerner from Carolina can only dominate the industry for so long because after Second World War, the first dollar blouse from Japan begins to arrive. All of a sudden, it's the Asian begins to dominate the textile industry. After the Japanese, it's the South Korean, it's the Taiwanese, it's Hong Kong, where I grew up in, and then across the border to mainland China, and then India, and then Bangladesh. In fact, if you're looking at the textile industry, it truly is the epic race to the bottom. And this is the statistics of the British textile mill. At its height of decline, one textile mill per week is closing down in Massachusetts, from Manchester all the way to London. And it's not just the collapse of a company, right? It's the collapse of an industrial base. It's a collapse of a community. In fact, this is the story that we've heard again and again from Detroit, Rust Belt, to different parts of the industrial basin that historically been led by the Western world. So the reason that we see this inevitable decline of pioneering company is quite simple, because in contrast to most people think there is always this first mover advantage, there is a whole set of circumstances that latecomer, in fact, would have more advantage than the pioneering firm. And the reason is simple, because every single industry in its very, very beginning, in order to make things work, you require highly well-trained expertise to build something based on intuition. Highly trained expert is very costly and yet very time consuming. All they do is sort of craftsmanship. So all industry begins from that phase. Now, over time, knowledge from the left would begins to transform to the type we see on the right, that things being written down, because if you were to scale your factory, for example, you have to write down the standard operating procedures. If you want to mass manufacture something, you need to translate something you know by heart into something can be read by others. Now, once things being written down, it's easy to get copied because it basically becomes simple rule-based decision making. Even lesser trained technician can do a similar job as well. So once this knowledge move from the left-hand side to the right, then latecomer begins to able to surpass the pioneering company in terms of manufacturing, because pioneering company tended to get stuck with their old way of manufacture and production based on craftsmanship setting, and the latecomer can simply jumpstart with mass production and eventually automation. Now, when I describe this dynamic, sometimes executive would tell me, yeah, I get it, Howard, but you know, in my own industry, I can always make the best product in the world. I'm going to pursue the niche market strategy, meaning you're going to make the best product, sort of Rolex and Longines of the world. You're going to make Rolex of the world for your own product. Now, here's the cautionary tale. Sometimes even when you make the best product in the world, doesn't mean that your financial outcome would be best. A case example is a company called Stanway and Son. So in my book, we talk and explore around the Stanway piano maker. So they are based in Astoria, outside of Manhattan. And for those who play a piano, if you're a professional musician, you love to play a Stanway concert grand piano. No two Stanway sounds the same. Their craftsmanship is world-class, from Lang Lang to Arthur Rubinstein. They would love to play on a Stanway grand concert piano. They grace White House all the way to different museums as well. But despite all this artistic achievement, if we go visit Stanway's financial history, it turns out to be almost an unmitigated disaster. Turns out Stanway and Son, when listed in the public, then they gone private again They went listed again and sell off to private investor and change hands ownership because they barely survive in terms of the global competition. And once upon in time, Stanway actually owned 600 acres of land across Astoria outside of New York, Manhattan. And today it got reduced to almost a single factory complex at the tip of Astoria. Now, who destroyed them? Turns out is Japanese Yamaha. So Yamaha came along. They not build big grand concert piano, but build upright piano. Everything they do is automation, mass manufacturing, in order to sell more piano faster. So over the years, in 20 years or so, they becomes the worldwide #1 piano maker in terms of volume. Around the 60s, they decided to enter the grand concert piano, the lifeblood of Stanway and Son. How do they learn that? They simply bought Stanway piano, take them apart, study the component part one by one. And this is how they learn to build a grand concert piano. And so this is a cautionary tale to remind us, even when a company build the best product in the world, if they don't embrace mass production and automation fast enough, sooner or later, the latecomer would catch them up. So the first principle in my book, we kind of discuss and trying to understand is really critical for executive and manager to first assess how widespread is that foundational knowledge is being learned by others. To what extent does your company's secret sauce is already well understood by other competitor? The wider it's being known by others, the higher the risk that these latecomer may catch up with what you're doing. So this is the very first principle. All right. So of course, the reason that I bring this up example is there are exceptions. Now in Switzerland, in the eastern part of Basel, there are many pharmaceutical firms worldwide. These are Novartis. These are Roche. These are big pharmaceutical drug makers who dominate the industry for more than 2 centuries. So along the River Rhine, you see in the middle picture, that's the city of Basel. It's beautiful. The living standard is one of the highest in Western Europe. And along the river, there are these pharmaceutical companies settled down in the city for more than 200 years. So I get curious, how come across the world, from automotive to personal computer to mobile phone, the latecomer really command an advantage, but how come in pharmaceutical industry, the Western company continue to command a leading position in this realm? So I went up to Basel to study their corporate archive to understand what's going on. Interestingly enough, Novartis' predecessors called Sieber, Geigy, and Sandoz, together with Roche. These guys historically were chemical dye manufacturers. They make chemical dye for the textile industry. Now, some of these chemists, by accident, they discover some sort of medicinal benefit of their molecule, so much so that they were able to come up with the first blockbuster. It's a fever-reducing drugs. It's called antipyrine. It is pioneered by a German company called Hoist. And then the copycat in Switzerland, back then, in the 19th century, there's no patent law in Switzerland. And so everyone copied the German invention and export to North America. In New York Times, 1903, there is an op-ed, and the complaint or the worry of American is whether the Swiss and the German manufacturer can produce enough of this antipyrine to satisfy the demand of America. So if you think for a moment, back then, the hotbed for innovation or the foundational knowledge for innovation for drug makers is all about organic chemistry. You need to become a chemist to discover a new drugs. Now, you might remember back in high school, you hear about the story of Alexander Fleming, who discovered the first antibiotics, penicillin. After the Second World War, from Sieber, Geigy, Sandoz, together with the United States, such as Pfizer, or in Europe, Sanofi, they all begins to identify what kind of fungus or mold can secrete molecules that can inhibit the growth of bacteria. Alexander Fleming, the way he discovered antibiotics is the study of microbiology. So all of a sudden, all the drug makers send their field worker to go up to mountains or go down to mine shaft to looking at the back of the refrigerator to find mold or fungus to in the hunt for the next paydirt, the more potent antibiotics. So the study of drugs discovery all at a sudden move away from organic chemistry to the new knowledge foundation called microbiology. So if I were to ask you what's hot today in terms of drug discovery, of course, it's a study of DNA, genetics, informatics, genomics. In fact, these days from HIV therapy all the way to targeted cancer drugs, everything in terms of drug discovery is pretty much rooted in the new knowledge discipline around bioinformatics and genomics. So if you're looking at the history of pharmaceutical industry, the reason that the pioneering company can continue to stay on top of competition is not because they become lower cost manufacturer. If they did, they would only be generic drugs company. But it's not because they just simply spend a lot of money on R&D. It's because the foundational knowledge jump from one knowledge discipline to the next to the next. This is why the leading company from Western Europe to the United States, they can continue to be very competitive in the global market. Compare and contrast to automotive industry, for example. In automotive industry, historically, it has been always about mechanical engineering. And until most recently, before autopilot and electric vehicle, it has always been mechanical engineering. Now, in that regard, if the underlying knowledge stays stagnant, then the latecomer would have a higher chance to catch up with the pioneering companies. So to summarize at this moment, there are two ways of looking at competition. At the very least, in regular competition, if the knowledge discipline stays stagnant, just like PC or automotive, it's like climbing up the mountain. In this world, when everyone is trying to reach the mountain top, sooner or later, the latecomer would reach the same height as the pioneering companies. However, if the knowledge discipline is similar to what we've seen in here in the in the pharmaceutical industry that leap from one knowledge to the next, then the mountaineering scenario almost like having constant mudslide that push everybody down constantly. Now, in this scenario, it's usually the one who are the most experienced, who knows the best, would have a better chance to successfully leap to the next knowledge frontier. Why? Because in order for you to be a great microbiologist, you need to be a great organic chemist. In order for you to understand human genomics and DNA, you need to be very good in the study of microbiology to start with. So what you know in the past actually matters a great deal. So with that, some people would suggest to me, I understand all that, Howard, but what if my industry is very boring? What if my own industry is like automotive? Am I doomed? So this is kind of interesting because as mundane as a company who sell laundry detergent and soap and so on, Procter & Gamble, P&G, continue to be the worldwide leader in consumer packaged goods. So I get curious because a personal computer, wind turbine, solar panel are being displaced by latecomer. Procter & Gamble should have gone long time ago, but they didn't. They actually stay on. So I went up to Cincinnati and trying to understand what allows Procter & Gamble to be so successful over the long run, because it's a 180-year-old company. So it turns out, in the very beginning, Mr. Procter and Mr. Gamble, they were forming a strategic partnership. They were making handheld soap, hand-dipped candle, and natural soap. Around that time, all they focus on is to building bigger factory. Then they begins to understand the importance of coming up with advertisement, because around 20, there's color printing, and later on, there's radio. And they discover that homemaker or housewife, they love to be entertained when doing household chore. So they end up producing opera, later known as radio opera or soap opera as a result. And then television came along and they continued to sponsor this television show. But all they know these days becomes how can we leverage consumer psychology so that people would buy more of our product. Now, there's a huge debate back then inside P&G because there are many advertising agencies. They're happy to take on all of the advertisement activity and let P&G to outsource. It's sort of like today, people debate about should we outsource our data analytics to third party or should we do it ourselves? P&G decided to do it themselves, so they stay on. And then later on, P&G discovered they can organically synthesize a detergent. They launched the very first synthetic detergent called Tide, the Tide detergent. And in the wake of the launch of Tide, the number of technicians basically tripled overnight. So it's this idea, even when you're P&G, staying on top of, competing on a mundane category. The reason that P&G can stay on over the course of 180 years and never get displaced is because they integrate different knowledge disciplines, from mechanical engineering in terms of mass production, all the way to consumer psychology, running advertisement, to later on integrate with organic chemistry in order to come up with waves of different synthetic product over the long run. Doesn't mean that P&G doesn't need to reinvent itself. Of course they do these days, particularly under the assault from e-commerce to subscription model to Amazon. They truly need to reinvent themselves because of the retail landscape continue to shift. But historically, what we've seen is this is how P&G survived in the past. So if we were to reduce 200 years of history, historical industrial history into one single word, it's really leap. If you were to survive over the long run, you have to leap from one knowledge discipline to the next, to the next. So this is all what part one I have described in the book. And what we do is, the principle number 2 is to think about in your sector or in your company, it's really important for you to acquire and cultivate new knowledge discipline over the long run. And in this scenario, if you were to reflect back in your company, what kind of innovation projects represent the ability to build on new knowledge and new capability? Now, some of these innovation projects truly is renovation. You try to become more efficient. But undoubtedly, there are some other type of innovation or some kind of projects that represent building up a new knowledge discipline. What they are and where can it take you? That's the kind of reflective question that we find it quite useful. Now, once we understand the importance of leap, then the next question becomes, where can we go next? Because as much as we understand we need to leap in order to prosper over the long run, the key question is, in the future, where should we leverage? And this is the part 2 of the book. We kind of project into the future. We want to understand where does it take us. And so on your left-hand side, it shows you around 12 years ago, the world's most valuable company. So you have ExxonMobil, you have General Electric, Gazprom, Microsoft, Citigroup, Bank of America, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, PetroChina, HSBC. These are the world's most valuable company on the face of the planet. 10 years on, turns out is Apple, is Google, is Microsoft, is Berkshire Hathaway, so that's Warren Buffett investment company. That's ExxonMobil, Amazon, Facebook, J&J, General Electric, China Mobile. Somehow a lot has been changed. And I get curious and I want to understand, well, is it a bubble or is it something to stay on? So 2 years later, I look back to the league table in 2018. It turns out it's still Apple, it's still Google, it's Microsoft, it's Amazon, Facebook. Now there are 2 Chinese companies popping up. It's Alibaba and Tencent, owners of WeChat, China's largest social media platform. Then followed by Berkshire Hathaway. So Warren Buffett is still doing quite well. J&J, Samsung, ExxonMobil, JP Morgan Chase. If I'm looking at this list between the left and the right, couple of things really jumped out at me that display what has changed around us. One is somehow historically, companies' value are driven by tangible asset back in 1970s. So tangible asset meaning your factory, your facilities, your equipment. These are tangibles. Intangibles could be your IP, your know-how, the data that you know, and so on. So historically, it's always the tangible asset are king. So if you own an oil field, if you own an iron ore, you are great. Today, tangible asset, in fact, is not that valuable anymore. Most of the value of a company are derived from intangible asset, meaning your IP, customer data, know-how, algorithm. That in part explains the chart that we see over here. Why are Apple, Google, Microsoft, all these companies becomes much more prominent than the old type of company. In fact, if you compare to the left and the right, it's almost data is the new oil. That's really jumped out from this chart. Now, the second part is every time of any sector, you can almost differentiate. There are 4 types of company. There are the asset builder. So every time they expand, they need to put up some new asset, like a factory or a ship. If you're a shipping line, for example, every time you expand a trade route, you put a new ship. They're a service provider. Service provider are bank, BCG, McKinsey, consulting firm, business school as well. Because every time a service provider expand, they need to hire people to be on the ground, to be foot soldiers, so to speak. There are the technology creator. This is SAP, Microsoft, Intel, Salesforce.com. They create technologies for others to use. The last part is network orchestrator. This is just a fancy word for platform like Uber, Airbnb, Amazon, Facebook. They link supply and demand. Facebook link advertiser versus consumer. Uber link rider versus driver. Airbnb link between traveler and host, apartment owner. What we see is platform player tended to command much more in terms of the stock price versus other category. And you may ask, why is that? Well, first off, because platform player, they tended to grow much faster. Imagine if you were to expand into a new geographical area. If you're a platform like Airbnb, you can enter a new geographical market almost overnight by switching on the algorithm. But if you're Hilton and Marriott, to enter a new country, you need to find a franchisee, you need to buy up a new hotel. It becomes much more costly and time consuming. So the growth rate for a platform usually be quicker. Now, on the other hand, in terms of profit of their core business, a platform is not bad because they don't need to invest a lot of money in physical asset, which is why we see what we saw earlier, that companies that are more like platform and technology driven, they tended to command a higher valuation of company. Now, all of these I mentioned is because the internet that we know of today is really going through 3 distinct phases with huge implication all across. The first wave is really the internet laying down the foundation. So you have companies such as American Online, Cisco, Sun Microsystem, laying down the foundation for the internet to begin. Then second wave is the internet or the consumer-based internet. You have Amazon, Snapchat, Google, Facebook, Twitter. They serve B2C company. They serve people. They serve product. Now, Steve Case, this former CEO of American Online who turned into a venture capitalist, he essentially said, we are moving to the final third wave of the internet. This is the kind of internet domain that historically are highly regulated. Life and death matters, and so is healthcare, is aviation, is transportation, is energy, is Internet of Things, is healthcare, is legal work. Think for a moment, if you're flying on a jet 5,000 feet high above ground, you want the jet engine to be branded by Rolls-Royce or GE, not Snapchat. So what Steve Case has been arguing, because the third wave of the internet is coming, which means that you can no longer just move fast and break things like Facebook. Because if Twitter breaks down, it's kind of okay, just people cannot tweet. But if, if something controlling your automotive or autopilot, if it crash, then that's life and death. So he described going forward is this idea that big company would align with small startup to reinvent different industry. And so it opens up new path for you to think about at the company. What are some of the seismic shift or the inevitable happening around us that we can leverage in order to leap to a new knowledge discipline? One idea coming along already, as we discussed in part 2 of the book, is connectivity. The reason that the consumer-based internet took off is because of the arrival of smartphone that is much easier for you to connect to others. The user interface is easier, is cheaper, is faster, and then it's no longer just people to people, but it's also people to machine, machine to machine, the Internet of Things. The other part, of course, is also this idea of advance of computing power, AI, right? So the next seismic shift, of course, is the advance of computing power. Here is a display of how computing power actually increased over centuries. At the turn of the century, on the far left-hand side of a tabulator, the computing power is pretty slow and clunky. In fact, if anything, compared to the animal kingdom, the neural connection is about one single bacterium. That's how bad it is. Over the years, computing power took off. On your y-axis, these are all the log scale. So it's not linear improvement. In fact, it's exponential improvement. So today, the high-end microprocessor inside your laptop is about the level of a small mouse brain. And if you put a lot of these small mouse brain together, magic can happen. This is why we hear about IBM Watson, who built up this machine to compete in a game show called Jeopardy on your right-hand side and beat human contestant. This is why AlphaGo, built up by Google DeepMind, is able to play the ancient board game called Go and beating the human contestant Lee Sedol in the worldwide basis. This is why Google also have Dublex, who can play telephone call and so intuitive that even human, as a restaurant owner who take up the phone call, couldn't differentiate whether it's a human or a machine. All of these are advance of really physical advancement of computing power as well. So you think for a moment for the kind of seismic shift around us or the inevitable, ultimately is this idea of ubiquitous connectivity together with the ideas of artificial intelligence. Now, that opens up new path for organization to think about how innovation can be organized. Because historically, every company, they would invest in their own R&D. They develop a small team of experts to invent the next big idea. The classic example is like Apple, right? They have the smartest engineers working in dark room, highly secretive, and develop the great product. Now, because of connectivity we experience these days, the idea from crowdsourcing to building up development kit to allow third-party API to come up with other product category becomes more and more important. So it's almost like moving from a craftsmanship type of decision-making into a mass production of decision by a large group of individuals. And of course, the last move is AI that automate a lot of this knowledge. And so the idea is companies must also automate not so much around the physical manufacturing, but also your decision making as well. Now that becomes very interesting because for human manager like you and I, then the idea is what kind of decision would continue to remain in the domain of human that will never be displaced by a machine, and what kind of decision you must turn over to machine so that your cost structure can become more competitive. There are studies that show over the last 30 years, from service industry to manufacturing industry, that we are really entering the great divergence or corporate inequality, meaning frontier company who can embrace robotics, AI, ubiquitous connectivity, rise of smart machine, they see their productivity really took off. And company who couldn't embrace as much, they see their productivity per employee decline. Think like a bank, right? If you're a bank, if you can embrace blockchain to AI to really automate a lot of back-end services, the productivity per employee, of course, would go up. And a bank who don't embrace all these would see that productivity per employee simply plummeted. Why? because customer requirement now really go up based on the leading player on what they can provide. So this is the idea that we must turn over whatever the mundane decision making over to machine so that you can become competitive. At the same time, explore what are some of the managerial decisions will continue to be human-centric, that you want to keep a human in the loop. So a lot of these are really comes down to experimentation. We're covering a lot of things that require new type of change, new way of working together, and it require new way of doing experimentation. The biggest risk among big company is they make a commitment and do a big splash into the marketplace and hope for the best. That's really high risk. What companies should do more and more is to run a number of experimentation so that you can gain early evidence before you commit. This is almost what Jeff Bezos from Amazon, he would always say. What really matters is companies that don't continue to experiment, companies that don't embrace failure, they eventually getting in such a desperate position where the only thing they can do is a Hail Mary bat at the very end of their corporate existence. Hail Mary bat for non-American audience here is the sort of American football that you try your very best, pray for the best outcome, and you give it a final shot. And so it's this idea that experimentation these days would become even more important as we move into the third wave of the internet. So in many ways, you could almost think for yourself at your company, how many experimentation have you taken part? Here's the good news. Running experiment can never be relied on robot and machine. A machine can help you to do big data analytics, but running experiment always requires certain creativity. It requires you to make sense of what it is about, the kind of experiment you try, how do we interpret data. These are all creative activity. And in the rise of the smart machine, there are areas you want to specialize, areas that require human empathy, human judgment, coaching, networking. These are the areas that probably would allow your career to take off. So I'm gonna pause here now because I'm gonna open up for more discussion from the audience to ask me questions. But to summarize, what we've seen today is that we noticed that competition, or specifically copycat competition, is all very, very common. We've seen copycat competition is everywhere. And historically, company who can actually survive and even prosper, they need to leap from one knowledge discipline to the next, to the next. That's the conclusion after 200 years of survey of industrial history. Now that we know the importance of leap, then the next phase is we need to project into the future where to leap next. There we identify two seismic shifts that we can leverage upon. One is ubiquitous connectivity. Second is the rise of smart machine. These are sort of the steam engine for the next 21st century, second half of the 21st century. Then we kind of highlight, in order to capitalize these opportunities, one has to run a lot of experimentation. It does opens up a debate or discussion around how do we build a corporate culture, how to regain your personal freedom in order to maintain your value in the global economy so that you won't get displaced, not just by low-cost workers, but also by cheap machine as well that are already smart. So with that, I'm gonna pass back to the organizer to open up the chat box for us to have a quick dialogue in terms of answering some of the questions that either related to the book or something that sparked your imagination as we go through the discussion up to this point. So thank you so much. I'm just noticing the time. We have past 4 o'clock already, and I'm so happy that I'm able to cover most of the questions being asked here. And please stay in touch, and you can check out my personal website as well. Is www.howardu.org, where you can see a lot more additional resources for the book. And there are many of the short articles that are published from Harvard Business Review and TV interviews that we can continue the dialogue. If you'd like to connect me on LinkedIn, please feel free to do so. I would love to stay in touch with many of you, and I wish you a great evening. And I'm going to turn over back to our organizer now.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. It was truly A huge pleasure for everyone here at HackerEarth to be doing this webinar with you. And also a special thanks to the audience for making time in their busy schedules to come and attend this webinar. We are really privileged to have you guys here as well. And I hope to see both Mr. Howard and all the people who attend this webinar in the upcoming webinar sessions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Have a great day ahead. Thank you, sir.